Tonight, we examine a case that once commanded national attention and then became part of British legal history. A single investigation, a single verdict never reached, and a legacy that has endured for more than a century. The case of Mary Ann Nichols begins in the City of London in the summer of 1845. She was born on the 26th of August of that year in the Fleet Street area to Edward Walker, a locksmith by trade, and Caroline Walker, whose maiden name was Webb. London, in 1845, was the largest city in the world, its population exceeding 2 million, expanding rapidly under the pressures of industrial growth and internal migration from the countryside. The City of London proper, where the Walker family lived, remained a dense warren of narrow courts, printing houses and small workshops, largely unchanged in its street pattern since before the Great Fire of 1666, though increasingly hemmed in by the railways and warehouses of a modernising capital. The Fleet Street district, in particular, was known for its printing and newspaper trades. Its narrow lanes lined with the premises of stationers, compositors, and pressmen, and its population drawn heavily from the skilled artisan class into which Edward Walker's occupation placed his family. A locksmith in this period occupied a respectable position within the hierarchy of London trades, requiring an apprenticeship and a degree of technical proficiency not available to unskilled labourers. The Walker household would have been modest but stable by the standards of the district, distinct from the extreme poverty that characterised other parts of the city at the same period. Dean Street, or Dawes Court, off Fleet Street, and the surrounding courts and alleys were typical of the close urban fabric of the area, buildings several stories high enclosing small yards, with limited access to open air or sanitation improvements that would not arrive in the City of London in any comprehensive form for several more decades. Gaslighting had been introduced to the major thoroughfares by this date, though the smaller courts and passages remained comparatively dark after nightfall. The sounds of the printing trade, the movement of paper and ink, and the proximity of the river Fleet, by then largely covered over and functioning as a sewer, formed the immediate sensory environment of Mary Ann Walker's earliest years. It was within this setting, among the trades and tenements of the City of London, that Mary Ann Walker passed her childhood, the second of the documented children in a household shaped by her father's craft and the ordinary rhythms of a working family in mid-Victorian London. The record of her earliest years is limited. No detailed account of her schooling survives, though the general expectation for a tradesman's daughter of this period and standing would have included at least a basic education in reading and religious instruction, likely provided through a local parish school or similar institution common to the City of London parishes at the time. Her family is known to have included siblings, among them a brother, Edward Walker the younger, though the full roster of children born to Edward and Caroline Walker is not consistently recorded across the surviving documentation. The household remained within the City of London through Mary Ann's childhood and adolescence, her father continuing in his trade as the family's principal means of support. On the 16th of January 1864, at St Bride's Church on Fleet Street, Mary Ann Walker was married to William Nichols, a printer's machinist. She was 18 years of age at the time of the marriage. St Bride's, sometimes called the Journalists' Church, for its long association with the printing and newspaper trades of the surrounding streets, stood at the centre of the district in which both families had their roots. William Nichols' occupation, operating and maintaining the machinery used in the printing process, placed him within the same general trade community as Mary Ann's father, and the union reflected the ordinary pattern of marriage within an established local trade network rather than any unusual circumstance. The couple began their married life in the City of London before their household expanded, and over the following years relocated within London as William Nichols' employment required. The marriage produced 5 children. Edward John Nichols was born in 1866, followed by Percy George in 1868, Alice Esther in 1870, Eliza Sarah in 1877, and Henry Alfred in 1879. The considerable gap between the third and fourth children, spanning several years, is noted in the surviving genealogical record without further explanation preserved in the documentation. For a period of more than a decade, the Nichols household functioned as an ordinary working family within London, William Nichols' trade providing a steady, if modest, income, and Mary Ann Nichols occupied with the raising of 5 children across those years. The family is recorded as having lived at various addresses during this period, consistent with the common pattern of tenancy changes among London's working population, who frequently relocated in response to employment, rent, or the availability of larger or smaller accommodation as their household size changed. The marriage began to deteriorate during the 1870s. The surviving record attributes this breakdown to 2 principal factors, though the precise sequence and weight of each is not established with certainty. William Nichols is reported to have formed a relationship with the nurse who had attended Mary Ann Nichols during one of her later confinements, an arrangement not uncommon in households of the period where a woman was engaged to assist during and after childbirth. Separately, Mary Ann Nichols is recorded by multiple sources as having developed a pattern of drinking during these years, a circumstance that contemporary accounts link to the strain placed upon the marriage. The couple separated and reconciled on more than one occasion during the latter part of the decade, a pattern documented in the family's later testimony, before separating permanently around 1880 or 1881. Following the permanent separation, William Nichols paid maintenance to Mary Ann Nichols for a period in keeping with the customary obligation of a husband toward an estranged wife under the domestic law of the period. This maintenance was later stopped, William Nichols asserting at a subsequent dispute over the payments that Mary Ann Nichols was supporting herself through prostitution. This assertion was made by William Nichols in the context of a maintenance disagreement and was not independently established through any contemporary investigation or documentation. The surviving record does not confirm that Mary Ann Nichols was working as a prostitute at this time, and the claim should be understood as one party's account within a domestic dispute rather than a proven fact. Contemporary and later descriptions of Mary Ann Nichols vary considerably. She is described in some accounts as a small woman, standing approximately 5 feet 2 inches in height, with a fondness for drink noted in her later years. Her father, Edward Walker, described her in testimony as having been respectable and hard-working earlier in her life. The reflexive characterization of her as a prostitute, applied by segments of the contemporary press following her death, is not supported by definitive contemporary evidence and appears to have rested largely on the circumstance of her presence, alone in Whitechapel during the nighttime hours. If value is found in cases preserved through court records, testimony, and verified documentation, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from. This story begins in an ordinary household, much like countless others across Victorian London, and follows its subject through a decade of increasing hardship toward a fate that would place her name permanently within the historical record. Following the permanent separation from her husband, Mary Ann Nichols entered a period of housing instability that would characterise the remainder of her life. The record documents her passage through several institutions during the 1880s, including Lambeth Workhouse and Endell Street Workhouse, interspersed with periods spent living with her father, Edward Walker, before renewed friction led to further separations. Workhouses of this period operated under the provisions of the Poor Law, offering shelter and basic subsistence to those without other means of support, in exchange for labour and a regime of strict discipline that many among the London poor regarded as a last resort rather than a preferred option. For a woman in Mary Ann Nichols' circumstances, separated from her husband and without independent income, The workhouse system represented one of the few institutional safety nets available, alongside the common lodging houses that proliferated throughout the East End of London during this period. During the middle years of the decade, Mary Ann Nichols is recorded as having lived for a time with a man named Thomas Stuart Drew, a blacksmith, though the duration and precise nature of this arrangement is not fully documented. By the spring of 1888, she was residing in a series of common lodging houses in the Spitalfields and Whitechapel districts of East London, an area that stood in marked contrast to the City of London parishes of her childhood. Whitechapel and Spitalfields by this date had become synonymous with severe overcrowding, poverty, and a large itinerant population dependent upon casual and seasonal labour. The common lodging houses of the district, sometimes called doss houses, offered a bed for a single night at a charge of 4p, payable in advance to a deputy who managed the premises and who was accustomed to turning away those unable to produce the fee. In May of 1888, Mary Ann Nichols took a position in domestic service with a family named Cowdrey, residing in Wandsworth in southwest London. This represented a documented attempt to establish a more settled situation, removed from the common lodging houses of the East End and placed instead within a private household of some respectability. A letter written by her employer survives in the historical record, referencing her departure from this position. Mary Ann Nichols left the Cowdrey household in July of 1888, having reportedly taken clothing belonging to the household valued at approximately £3.10, which she subsequently pawned. This episode, verified through the surviving correspondence, marks the end of her documented effort to remain in settled employment and her return to the common lodging houses of Spitalfields and Whitechapel in the final weeks of her life. By August of 1888, Mary Ann Nichols was lodging at 18 Thrall Street in Spitalfields, sharing a room with several other women in the manner typical of the common lodging houses of the district. Some sources place her final lodging instead at 56 Flower and Dean Street, a short distance away, and the precise address in the days immediately preceding her death is not established with complete certainty across the surviving accounts, though 18 Thrall Street is the address most consistently cited. The common lodging houses of this period offered shared, dormitory-style accommodation, with small communal kitchens and little privacy, housing a transient population of casual labourers, market workers, and others without stable residence. It was from this environment, in the final days of August 1888, that Mary Ann Nichols moved through the streets of Whitechapel toward the events that would end her life. The final night of Mary Ann Nichols' life is documented through the testimony of several witnesses who observed her at intervals during the late hours of the 30th of August and the early hours of the 31st. At approximately 11 o'clock in the evening, she was seen on Whitechapel Road. At approximately midnight, she was seen leaving the Frying Pan public house on Brick Lane. Sometime between 1 o'clock and 20 minutes to 2 in the morning, she returned to the lodging house at 18 Thrall Street, but was turned away by the deputy in charge for lacking the 4p required for her bed. According to testimony given at the subsequent inquest, she responded to this refusal by remarking that she would soon have the money, drawing attention to a new bonnet she had recently acquired as evidence that she expected to earn her lodging fee before the night was out. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, Mary Ann Nichols was seen by Emily Holland, a fellow lodger at the Thrall Street house at the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. According to Emily Holland's testimony, Mary Ann Nichols stated that she had already earned her lodging money 3 times over that day and had spent it on drink, and that she expected to obtain more before returning to her lodgings. Emily Holland attempted to persuade her to return to the lodging house rather than continue on her way, but Mary Ann Nichols declined and walked off in the direction of Whitechapel Road, heading east. This encounter with Emily Holland represents the last confirmed sighting of Mary Ann Nichols alive, occurring approximately 1 hour before her body was discovered. The record of this final evening establishes a consistent pattern across each of the witnessed encounters. Mary Ann Nichols moved through familiar streets within a small radius of her lodging house, made and abandoned brief plans for shelter, and expressed confidence in her ability to secure the fee required for her bed before the night concluded. No witness reported any sign of distress, threat, or unusual company accompanying her during these hours. The interval between the sighting by Emily Holland at 2:30 and the discovery of her body shortly before 4 o'clock represents the window within which the events that ended her life took place, a period during which no witness has been documented as having observed her again until her body was found. The location at which Mary Ann Nichols' body was found was Bucks Row, a narrow street in Whitechapel that would shortly afterward be renamed Durward Street, running between Whitechapel Road and Baker's Row. The street was lined with small terraced houses and a board school, and stood close to a stable yard gateway associated with Brown Stable Yard and the premises known as Essex Wharf. Gas lighting in this part of Whitechapel was sparse, and the immediate vicinity of Bucks Row was ill-lit even by the general standard of the district. The street lay within an area given over largely to slaughterhouses, market trades, and the movements of night labourers, carmen and porters making their way to work in the pre-dawn hours, a population whose daily routines would place 2 such men at the scene within minutes of the murder having been committed. Charles Cross, a carman on his way to work, came upon the body lying on the pavement outside the gated stable entrance at approximately 20 minutes to 4 in the morning. Charles Cross gave his evidence under that name, though his legal and birth name was Charles Allen Lechmere, Cross being the surname of his stepfather and the name by which he was more commonly known. He was joined moments later by a second carman, Robert Paul, also walking to his place of employment along the same route. In the near-total darkness of the street, the 2 men were initially unable to determine whether the woman before them was dead or merely intoxicated, a common enough sight in the streets of Whitechapel at that hour. Robert Paul later testified that he believed he detected faint breathing when he examined her, though this account sits uneasily against the subsequent medical estimate of the time of death and is generally understood by those who have studied the case as reflecting the men's uncertainty and poor light rather than any genuine indication that she remained alive when they found her. Neither man noticed the wound to her throat in the darkness. Having touched her hands and found them cold, the 2 carmen went in search of a police constable, encountering Constable Jonas Misen on Baker's Row and alerting him to the discovery. Independently of Charles Cross and Robert Paul, Constable John Neal came upon the same body during his beat at approximately the same hour, and it was Constable Neal who, using his lantern, discovered that the woman's throat had been severed. He summoned Constable John Thane and Sergeant Kirby to the scene, and a local surgeon, Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn, whose practice stood on Whitechapel Road, was sent for, and arrived shortly afterward. Dr. Llewellyn pronounced life extinct at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, and estimated at the scene that death had occurred not more than 30 minutes prior to his examination. Constable Neal noted that he had passed the same spot on his beat approximately 30 minutes earlier, and had observed nothing at that time, a detail that placed the killing within a narrow window between his 2 passes along the street. The investigation into the death of Mary Ann Nichols was formally opened in the hours following the discovery of her body. Bucks Row fell within the jurisdiction of J Division of the Metropolitan Police, based in Bethnal Green, and it was officers of that division who conducted the initial response, though the wider series of Whitechapel murders that would follow in the coming weeks was more generally associated with the neighbouring H Division. The body was removed from Bucks Row to the mortuary on Old Montague Street, where it would subsequently be examined in greater detail. Constables were dispatched to conduct house-to-house inquiries among the residents of Bucks Row and the surrounding streets in the hours after the discovery, seeking any account of unusual sounds or activity during the night. These inquiries produced little of substance. Residents of the houses closest to the site where the body was found reported having heard nothing unusual during the night, a circumstance noted with some frustration by the investigating officers given the severity of the injuries that had been inflicted. This absence of any reported disturbance was understood by those conducting the investigation as reflecting the effectiveness and speed with which the attack had been carried out, rather than as evidence of any irregularity in the residents' accounts. No weapon was recovered at the scene, and no footprints or other trace evidence were identified that could be connected to a suspect. Some blood was noted pooled beneath the body where it had been found, consistent with the location being the site of the attack itself, rather than a location to which the body had been moved. The identification of the victim was accomplished through a distinctive stencil mark found on her petticoat, reading Lambeth Workhouse, with the initials PR for Prince's Road, indicating the institution through which she had passed during her period of housing instability earlier in the decade. This mark led investigating officers to the records of Lambeth Workhouse, and from there to the identification of the deceased as Mary Ann Nichols. The identification was subsequently confirmed through the direct testimony of two witnesses who viewed the body at the mortuary, her father, Edward Walker, and her estranged husband, William Nichols, both of whom independently identified the deceased as Mary Ann Nichols. Inspector Joseph Helson of J Division held initial charge of the investigation at the local level in the days immediately following the discovery of the body. As the pattern of murders in the district became apparent over the following weeks, Inspector Frederick Aberline was brought in from Scotland Yard's central office to coordinate the wider investigation into what would become known as the Whitechapel murders. No arrest was made in connection with the death of Mary Ann Nichols specifically, and the investigation into her murder did not result in any suspect being charged. The house-to-house inquiries, the examination of the scene, and the identification of the victim together constituted the principal investigative steps undertaken in the days immediately following the discovery, and none of these steps produced a line of enquiry that led to an identified perpetrator. The post-mortem examination of Mary Ann Nichols was conducted by Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn, who had earlier examined the body at the scene in Bucks Row. The examination established that the cause of death was exsanguination resulting from injuries to the throat which had been inflicted with sufficient severity to cause death rapidly. Dr. Llewellyn's examination, conducted first at the scene and later in fuller detail at the mortuary once the body had been undressed, also identified additional injuries to the lower abdomen inflicted after death had already occurred. The examination found no evidence of sexual assault, a finding that Dr. Llewellyn stated explicitly in his evidence. Dr. Llewellyn's assessment of the abdominal injuries was later regarded by some as less thorough than the examinations conducted in the cases of subsequent victims later in the series, a circumstance generally attributed to the fact that the Nichols case was the first of its kind to come before investigators, before any pattern connecting it to later killings had been recognised. Dr. Llewellyn's estimate of the time of death, given as not more than 30 minutes prior to his examination at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, was consistent with the timeline established through witness testimony. Emily Holland's sighting of Mary Ann Nichols alive at approximately 2:30 in the morning, combined with the discovery of the body at approximately 20 minutes to 4, established a window of roughly 70 to 75 minutes, during which the killing occurred. A window narrowed further by Constable Neal's uneventful pass along Bucks Row, approximately half an hour before he came upon the body. The medical evidence, taken together with the accounts of those who had seen her in the hours before her death, established with reasonable confidence both the manner and approximate timing of the killing, while leaving the identity of the person responsible entirely unknown. The inquest into the death of Mary Ann Nichols was opened on the 1st of September 1888 and continued across several subsequent sessions through the month of September, held at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road. The proceedings were conducted before Win Edwin Baxter, coroner for the South Eastern District of Middlesex. Testimony was heard from a number of witnesses over the course of the inquest, including Edward Walker, the victim's father, and William Nichols, her estranged husband, both of whom testified to matters of identification and to the history of the marriage and separation. Emily Holland gave testimony concerning her final encounter with Mary Ann Nichols in the early hours of the 31st of August, establishing the last confirmed sighting of the victim alive. Charles Cross and Robert Paul each testified concerning the discovery of the body, as did Constable John Neal, Constable John Thane, and Dr. Rhys Llewellyn, whose evidence addressed both the condition of the body at the scene and the findings of the subsequent post-mortem examination. The deputy of the lodging house at Thrall Street also gave testimony concerning Mary Ann Nichols' presence there in the hours before her death and the circumstances under which she had been turned away for lack of her lodging fee. Across these several sessions, the coroner and jury heard a detailed account of Mary Ann Nichols' final hours, the discovery of her body, and the medical findings established through the post-mortem examination. At the conclusion of the inquest, the jury returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. No individual was named in connection with the verdict, and no committal to trial followed, as no suspect had been identified or charged in connection with the killing. The inquest record stands as the most complete surviving account of the circumstances of Mary Ann Nichols' death, drawn together from the testimony of those who knew her, those who encountered her in her final hours, and those who examined her body and the scene where it was found. No trial took place in connection with this case, as no person was ever brought before the court to answer for her death, and the record available for this account does not establish the identity of the person responsible with any certainty. The immediate aftermath of Mary Ann Nichols' death was marked by intense coverage in the London press, coverage that began a pattern of sensationalist reporting which would deepen considerably over the following weeks as further killings occurred in the same district. Public alarm within Whitechapel grew in the days following the discovery of her body, though the organised vigilance activity that would come to characterise the autumn of 1888, including the formation of committees such as the Mile End Vigilance Committee, developed more fully in the weeks after subsequent murders rather than immediately in the aftermath of this first killing. The name by which the unidentified perpetrator would become widely known did not enter public use until several weeks later, following a letter received by a news agency in late September of 1888, a letter whose authenticity remains disputed among those who have studied the case, and whose appearance postdates the death of Mary Ann Nichols by some weeks. The investigation into her death and into the killings that followed it in the same district over the subsequent weeks drew criticism in the press and in official circles toward the Metropolitan Police over the failure to identify a suspect. This criticism, directed in part at the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, continued to build over the autumn of 1888 and culminated in his resignation, tendered on the 8th of November of that year, the day before the final killing attributed to the same series. The Home Secretary at the time was Henry Matthews, whose department bore ultimate responsibility for the conduct of the Metropolitan Police during a period of sustained public criticism. These matters of wider administrative consequence fall somewhat outside the specific investigation into the death of Mary Ann Nichols, but form part of the documented context in which that investigation proceeded and ultimately concluded without a suspect identified. The investigation into the death of Mary Ann Nichols did not result in an arrest, and no person was ever charged in connection with her killing. The case file, together with the inquest record and the testimony gathered in its course, represents the full extent of the documentation surviving from the official investigation. No suspect was named with sufficient supporting evidence to warrant prosecution, and the identity of the individual responsible for her death has never been established. Numerous theories concerning the identity of the perpetrator have circulated in the decades since 1888, some naming specific individuals who came to the attention of investigators during the wider series of killings in the districts that year. None of these theories has been substantiated through the surviving record to the standard that would allow any individual to be named as responsible with confidence, and this account does not attribute her death to any named suspect. One detail concerning the discovery of her body has attracted particular attention in later examination of the case. Charles Cross, the carman who first came upon Mary Ann Nichols' body, testified under a name that was not his legal birth name, having been born Charles Allen Lechmere and having adopted the surname of his stepfather in general use. This circumstance is documented and verifiable through genealogical records and represents a genuine curiosity within the case file. It should be understood strictly as a minor point of nomenclature arising from a common practice of the period in which a stepfather's surname was frequently adopted in informal usage, and not as an indication of any irregularity in his conduct or account. The surviving record does not establish any basis for regarding either Charles Cross or Robert Paul as suspects in the killing, and their role in the case remains that of the two men who discovered the body while walking to their places of employment in the early hours of the morning. Mary Ann Nichols was buried on the 6th of September 1888 at the City of London Cemetery in Little Ilford Manor Park, in a public grave. Her burial took place within a week of the conclusion of the initial sessions of the inquest into her death, and was attended amid the growing public attention that had by that point begun to fix upon the killing as part of a wider and continuing series. Her husband, William Nichols, and their 5 children survived her. Her father, Edward Walker, who had identified her body at the mortuary and testified at the inquest into her death, lived until 1893. These details of the family who remained after her death form part of the documented record, though the case itself, so far as the official investigation was concerned, closed without any resolution as to who had been responsible. The case of Mary Ann Nichols occupies a specific position within the wider history of the killings that took place in Whitechapel during the autumn of 1888. She is generally accepted both within the contemporary police records and within the great majority of subsequent historical accounts as the first of what came to be known as the canonical 5 victims of the killer popularly termed Jack the Ripper. The designation of these 5 cases as a canonical group is itself a later historiographical convention developed within 20th century scholarship on the subject, distinguishing these 5 killings from a number of other murders committed in the same district during the same general period, which may or may not have been connected to the same individual. This distinction was not a term used by the police or press at the time of Mary Ann Nichols' death, and its application to her case reflects a later effort by historians and researchers to establish which killings could be reliably grouped together on the basis of the surviving evidence. The wider series of killings of which her death is considered the first has generated an extraordinarily large body of subsequent examination, extending across published books, films, television productions, museums, and organised walking tours of the district in which the killings occurred, together with a continuing tradition of amateur and academic investigation into the case that persists into the present day. For a considerable period following 1888, Mary Ann Nichols' own biography was frequently overshadowed within this body of examination by the wider mythology that developed around the unidentified killer, with attention directed toward theories of his identity rather than toward the lives of the women whose deaths constituted the case. This pattern shifted with the publication in 2019 of a work titled The Five by the historian Hallie Rubenhold, which received the Baillie Gifford Prize and presented a detailed biographical account of each of the 5 women, including Mary Ann Nichols, examining their lives independently of the killer and pushing back specifically against the assumption, widespread in the contemporary press of 1888, that each of the women had been working as a prostitute at the time of her death. Mary Ann Nichols has appeared as a figure within numerous dramatised treatments of the wider case in the decades since her death, generally as part of an ensemble portrayal of the 5 women rather than as the subject of any dedicated individual work. No specific ballad, play or film has been produced that focuses on her account alone, and her presence within the broader cultural memory of the case has generally been tied to her position as its first documented victim, rather than to any distinct narrative developed around her individually. The renewed biographical attention brought to her case through recent scholarship has increasingly framed her, consistent with the documented record, as an individual shaped by the ordinary pressures of marriage, family, and poverty common to many women of her class and period, rather than through the reductive characterizations applied to her in the press coverage that followed her death. The social and historical context within which Mary Ann Nichols' final months took place was shaped substantially by the conditions prevailing in Whitechapel and Spitalfields during the final decades of the 19th century. These districts were characterized by severe overcrowding, a large itinerant population dependent upon casual and seasonal labour, and a heavy reliance upon common lodging houses, of the kind in which Mary Ann Nichols spent her final weeks. Contemporary social surveys of London conducted during this general period documented widespread poverty, precarious female employment, and periodic recourse to prostitution among women without other means of support, conditions well established in the historical record of the district independent of any individual case. The presence of a substantial immigrant population, drawn particularly from Ireland and from Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, further shaped the character of the district, which had by this date become a particular focus of social reform attention and press scrutiny. Within this context, the housing instability that marked Mary Ann Nichols' final years, her passage through workhouses and common lodging houses, and her brief attempt to secure more settled employment in domestic service, are consistent with patterns well documented among women of similarly limited means during this period. The record available for this account does not establish that she was engaged in prostitution at the time of her death, notwithstanding the assumptions made by the contemporary press on the basis of the circumstances in which her body was found. Her circumstances in the final months of her life are better understood as a product of the housing and economic conditions prevailing in Whitechapel and Spitalfields during this period than as any reflection of individual conduct, a framing consistent with the most recent scholarly examination of her case. The mortuary at Old Montague Street, to which Mary Ann Nichols' body was conveyed following its removal from Bucks Row, was attached to the workhouse infirmary and staffed by attendants accustomed to receiving the dead from across the district. Before Dr. Llewellyn had completed a full examination of the body, workhouse infirmary attendants stripped and washed it in accordance with the ordinary procedure followed at the mortuary, a practice later noted with some concern by those reviewing the case, since it meant that the abdominal injuries were not observed and documented until after the body had already been cleaned. This circumstance is understood to have contributed to the comparatively limited detail preserved in the earliest record of the abdominal wounds, a limitation attributed to the procedures in place at the mortuary rather than to any deficiency in Dr. Llewellyn's examination itself. Inspector Helson, upon learning of the full extent of the injuries, once the body had been undressed, directed that closer attention be paid in subsequent cases to preserving the condition of a body at the scene before any such handling took place. A procedural adjustment that reflects the investigation into Mary Ann Nichols' death as the point at which this particular lesson was learned. The clothing recovered from Mary Ann Nichols' body was examined as part of the investigation and was found to be worn but unremarkable, consistent with the possessions of a woman lodging in common lodging houses of the district. Her brown Ulster coat, with its distinctive metal buttons bearing the mark of a workhouse, and the petticoat carrying the Lambeth workhouse stencil, together provided the material basis upon which her identity was subsequently confirmed. Investigating officers catalogued these items as part of the ordinary procedure followed in cases of this kind, cross-referencing the workhouse markings against institutional records, before proceeding to seek confirmation from family members. This process, though ultimately successful in establishing her identity within a short span of time following the discovery of her body, illustrates the reliance placed by the investigation upon institutional records of poverty and dependency, themselves a product of the same conditions of housing instability that had shaped the final years of her life. Testimony given at the inquest by Edward Walker addressed not only the formal matter of identification, but also the history of his daughter's marriage and the circumstances of her later years, insofar as he was able to speak to them. He testified to her earlier reputation as a respectable and hard-working woman, and to the breakdown of relations between father and daughter that had followed her increasingly unsettled circumstances during the 1880s. William Nichols, called separately, testified to the history of the marriage, its breakdown during the 1870s, and the arrangements and disputes concerning maintenance payments that had followed the couple's permanent separation. The coroner, Wynne Baxter, directed his questioning toward establishing a clear account of Mary Ann Nichols' movements and associations in the period leading up to her death, questioning that drew out the testimony concerning her residence at the Thrall Street lodging house and her habits in the weeks immediately preceding the 31st of August. The inquest proceedings, extending across several sessions through the month of September, reflected the coroner's evident intention to establish as full and careful a record as the available witnesses could provide, a thoroughness that has left a comparatively detailed documentary account of the case for later examination. Wynne Baxter's conduct of the inquest, addressing matters ranging from the medical findings to the domestic history of the victim, established a model that would be followed, with variations in the inquests convened into the subsequent killings in the same district during the autumn of 1888. The verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown, returned at the conclusion of these sessions, represented the formal and final legal determination reached in connection with the death of Mary Ann Nichols, a determination that has not been superseded or amended by any subsequent legal proceeding in the more than a century that has followed. The investigation into her death, considered as a whole, proceeded through the ordinary stages available to the Metropolitan Police under the investigative methods of the period: the securing of the scene, the examination of the body, the identification of the victim through institutional and family testimony, the canvassing of residents in the immediate vicinity, and the convening of a coroner's inquest to establish a formal record and verdict. Each of these stages was completed within a period of approximately 1 week following the discovery of the body. What the investigation did not achieve, at any point in the weeks, months, or years that followed, was the identification of a suspect against whom sufficient evidence could be assembled to bring a prosecution. This absence of resolution, notwithstanding the diligence reflected in the surviving investigative and inquest record, has remained the defining characteristic of the case in the century and more since Mary Ann Nichols' death. The wider killings that followed in Whitechapel over the weeks after Mary Ann Nichols' death, beginning with the death of Annie Chapman on the 8th of September 1888, drew the investigation into her case into a broader inquiry that would occupy the Metropolitan Police for the remainder of that year and beyond. The resources directed toward the wider series of killings, coordinated in significant part through Inspector Aberline following his assignment from Scotland Yard, did not result in the identification of a suspect connected to Mary Ann Nichols' death specifically, notwithstanding the considerable scale of the investigation that developed around the district in the months that followed. The case file concerning her death remained and remains part of the larger body of documentation associated with the Whitechapel murders of 1888, a body of documentation that has been examined, cross-referenced, and reassessed by successive generations of investigators, historians, and researchers in the century, and more since the events themselves. Bucks Row itself, the street in which her body was found, was renamed Durward Street in 1892, several years after the events of the 31st of August, 1888, a change attributed by some later commentators to a wish among residents to dissociate the street from the notoriety that had attached to it. The street's earlier character as a narrow residential thoroughfare adjoining a stable yard and situated near a board school was substantially altered in the decades that followed through redevelopment of the district, though the general location remained identifiable within the topography of Whitechapel. The stable yard gateway outside which Mary Ann Nichols' body was found, and the board school that stood nearby were features documented at the inquest and in contemporary press accounts as part of the effort to establish a precise record of the scene, a record that has continued to be referenced in subsequent examinations of the case. The historical legacy of Mary Ann Nichols' death rests substantially upon her documented position as the first of the 5 killings generally accepted as connected within the series that has come to be known by the name first publicised in the letter received by a news agency several weeks after her death. This position has ensured that her case has remained a fixed point of reference within the much larger body of examination directed toward the Whitechapel murders as a whole, even as her individual biography received comparatively less sustained attention than the mystery surrounding the identity of the person responsible for her death and the deaths that followed it. The record established through the investigation and inquest into her death, limited though it is in its failure to identify a perpetrator, remains detailed in its account of her final months, her final hours, and the medical and procedural facts surrounding the discovery of her body, a level of documentation that has allowed her case to be examined with considerable specificity by historians in the decades since 1888. In the weeks that followed the discovery of Mary Ann Nichols' body, the Metropolitan Police increased the number of officers assigned to patrol the streets of Whitechapel during the nighttime hours, and additional gaslighting was subsequently installed in some of the district's darker thoroughfares, including in the vicinity of Bucks Row itself. These measures, implemented in direct response to the circumstances of her death and the darkness in which it had gone unwitnessed, reflected an acknowledgement by local authorities that the physical conditions of the street, its poor illumination, and its comparative seclusion behind the stable yard gateway had contributed to the ease with which the attack had gone unseen and unheard. The Whitechapel District Board of Works, responsible for matters of local infrastructure, including street lighting, received representations in the weeks following her death, urging improvements to the lighting of the district's smaller streets and courts, though the pace of such improvements across the wider district remained gradual in the years that followed. The 5 children of Mary Ann Nichols and William Nichols, ranging in age at the time of their mother's death from approximately 9 to 22 years, are not extensively documented in the surviving record beyond their births and their father's continued residence, with at least some of them following the permanent separation from their mother. The eldest, Edward John, would have been approximately 22 years of age in 1888, while the youngest, Henry Alfred, would have been approximately 9. William Nichols retained custody of the children following the separation from Mary Ann Nichols, in keeping with the general pattern of domestic arrangements of the period once a permanent separation had occurred. The surviving record does not provide a detailed account of the children's lives following their mother's death, and this account does not extend speculation beyond what the documentation establishes. Edward Walker's testimony at the inquest, in which he described his daughter as having been respectable and hard-working in her earlier years, stands in the surviving record as one of the few direct personal characterizations of Mary Ann Nichols offered by someone who had known her across the whole of her life, from childhood in the City of London, through her marriage, the birth of her children, and the years of increasing hardship that followed her separation from her husband. This testimony, delivered by a father called upon to identify the body of his daughter and to account for her history before a coroner's jury, forms part of the documentary foundation upon which later biographical treatments of her case, including the scholarship of the 21st century that has sought to recover her individual life from beneath the wider mythology of the killings, have principally relied. The investigation into the death of Mary Ann Nichols, considered in full, produced a documentary record notable for its detail regarding the victim's final hours and its comparative silence regarding the identity of the person responsible. Statements were taken from each witness able to speak to her movements on the night of her death. A post-mortem examination was conducted and its findings entered into evidence, and an inquest was convened and carried through to a formal verdict. Each of these procedural steps was completed in accordance with the standard practice of the period. What remained absent, notwithstanding the completion of every available investigative step, was any evidence sufficient to identify, still less to charge, the individual responsible for the injuries that caused her death. The case was, in this respect, thoroughly investigated and entirely unresolved, a combination that has defined its place in the historical record for more than a century since the verdict was returned. The closing sessions of the inquest included remarks from Coroner Wynne Baxter, summarising the evidence heard across the several weeks of proceedings, in which he noted the difficulty the case presented to the jury given the absence of any witness to the attack itself and the absence of any physical evidence connecting a specific individual to the crime. Baxter's summation directed the jury toward the verdict ultimately returned: willful murder against some person or persons unknown, a form of verdict available to a coroner's jury when the evidence established that a killing had taken place, but did not permit the naming of a responsible party. This verdict, formally recorded at the conclusion of the inquest, closed the coronial proceedings into Mary Ann Nichols' death without resolving the question of who had been responsible, leaving that question to whatever further investigation the Metropolitan Police might subsequently pursue. The funeral arrangements for Mary Ann Nichols were made in the days following the conclusion of the initial inquest sessions, with her father, Edward Walker, taking a leading role in arranging for her burial at the City of London Cemetery in Little Ilford. Press accounts of the period noted that a crowd gathered outside the cemetery at the time of the burial on the 6th of September, 1888, drawn by the considerable public attention the case had already attracted in the week following the discovery of her body. The burial itself took place in a public grave, in keeping with the modest means of the family, and was conducted without the elaborate ceremony that might have attended a case of similar notoriety involving a family of greater means. William Nichols is recorded as having attended the funeral of his estranged wife, alongside members of her family, bringing to a close the formal proceedings connected with her death within little more than a week of the discovery of her body in Bucks Row. The press coverage that had begun with the discovery of the body continued in the days surrounding the funeral, with several London newspapers publishing accounts of the burial itself, alongside continuing coverage of the ongoing investigation. This coverage, appearing in publications including the East London Observer and other papers circulating in the district, contributed to the establishment of Mary Ann Nichols' case within the public consciousness of London during the first days of September 1888, well before the subsequent killings later that month would draw the case into the wider and more sustained public attention that has persisted in the more than a century since. The pattern of press interest evident in these early September accounts, characterised by considerable attention to procedural detail alongside a degree of speculation concerning the character and circumstances of the victim, established a template that would recur across the coverage of each of the killings that followed in the same district over the subsequent weeks. The investigation was formally closed without an arrest. No suspect was ever charged. The case remains open and the record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the first case ends. What follows turns to a second story, quieter than the first and set many years earlier, in a small market town far removed from the streets of the capital. It is a case that unfolded within a close and orderly religious community, and it turned upon a question that no inquest, however long it sat, was ever able to answer. The case of Harriet Monckton begins in Bromley, Kent, in the autumn of 1843. Bromley in 1843 was a market town of modest size, situated some 10 miles southeast of London, distinct in character from the metropolis and governed by its own rhythms of trade, worship, and local administration. The town's principal thoroughfare was its high street, lined with shops, inns, and private residences, along which stood several places of worship, serving the town's Anglican and nonconformist populations alike. Among these was the Independent Chapel, a Congregationalist meeting house that served a close-knit body of worshippers who gathered for regular services and weekday prayer meetings throughout the year. The chapel occupied a position of some importance within the social life of the town, offering not only religious instruction, but a network of acquaintance, obligation, and mutual observation among its members. The economy of Bromley in this period rested on its function as a market town, serving the surrounding agricultural district of Kent, supplemented by the trades and small industries typical of such a settlement, including shoemaking, building, and domestic service. The population was not large by the standards of London, and a town of this size meant that its residents were known to one another in ways that a large city did not permit. Streets were lit, where lit at all, by gas or oil lamps placed at intervals, leaving long stretches of darkness once the sun had set, particularly in the shorter days of early November. The chapel itself stood with an attached privy to its rear, a common feature of public buildings of the period, situated outside the main structure and unlit, reached by a path from the chapel yard. Religious nonconformity in early Victorian England, and Congregationalism in particular, placed considerable emphasis on moral conduct and communal accountability. Membership within such a chapel was not a passive affiliation. It carried expectations of regular attendance, participation in prayer meetings, and a standard of personal behaviour that was subject to the observation and at times the judgment of fellow congregants. Bromley's Independent Chapel functioned in this respect as many such congregations did throughout the country, drawing together tradesmen, professionals, and their families into a body bound as much by social obligation as by doctrine. It was within this setting that Harriet Monckton was known. Harriet Monckton was 23 years of age at the time of her death. The surviving record does not establish with confidence the date or place of her birth, nor does it preserve the names of her parents or any siblings she may have had. What can be stated is that by 1843 she was an unmarried woman residing in or near Bromley and active within the life of the Independent Chapel, where she was regarded according to surviving local accounts, as a respectable and well-known figure within the congregation. Some sources describe her as having worked in a capacity connected to teaching, though this detail is not corroborated with the certainty that would allow it to be stated as established fact, and it is presented here with that qualification. The absence of a fuller documented history of her early life is itself part of the record as it survives, and no attempt is made here to supply what the record does not provide. By the autumn of 1843, Harriet Monckton was approximately 6 months pregnant. She was not married. The identity of the father of her unborn child is not established in the surviving record, and it remained, at the time and since, one of the central unresolved questions of the case. Whether her condition was known within the chapel community at large or concealed from most of its members is likewise not established with certainty. What is documented is that her pregnancy, once discovered, stood in stark contrast to the standards of conduct expected of a member of a nonconformist congregation of this period, and that this contrast shaped much of the contemporary speculation that followed her death. Within Monckton's circle of acquaintance at the chapel were at least 2 men whose names would come to figure prominently in the record of the case that followed. One was Thomas Churcher, a shoemaker associated with the chapel community. The other was George Verrill, the minister of the independent chapel. Both men were examined in connection with the investigation into Monckton's death, and both were named in contemporary press accounts as objects of local suspicion. Neither man was ever charged with any offence in connection with her death, and neither was brought to trial. The record does not establish that either man fathered her child, supplied any substance found in her body, or was present with her during the final hours of her life. What the record establishes is only that both men were known to her, that both were questioned, and that suspicion fell upon each of them in the town at the time, without resolution. On the evening of Monday, the 6th of November, 1843, Harriet Monckton attended a prayer meeting at the Independent Chapel. This was consistent with her regular participation in the life of the congregation. She was seen by other members of the chapel that evening in the ordinary course of the meeting. At some point following the conclusion of the prayer meeting, she left the chapel. She was not seen alive again by any witness whose account has survived in reliable form. The precise sequence of her movements between her departure from the chapel and her death is not established in the surviving record. This gap is a genuine feature of the case, and it is treated here as such, rather than filled with invented detail. On the morning of Tuesday, the 7th of November, 1843, Harriet Monckton's body was discovered in the privy situated behind the Independent Chapel. The body was discovered by Thomas Churcher, who had seen her at the prayer meeting the previous evening. What is established is that the discovery was made in the early morning hours, that the location was the chapel's outdoor privy, and that the body was that of a young woman well known within the congregation that used the building the previous evening. The news of her death and the circumstances of its discovery within the grounds of the chapel itself spread quickly through the town. The circumstances surrounding Harriet Monckton's final hours, considered together, present a case defined as much by what is not known as by what is. She was last seen alive at a religious meeting attended by people who knew her well. She was found dead the following morning within a short distance of that same meeting place, in a location she would have had reason to visit in the ordinary course of an evening at the chapel. Between those 2 points the record is silent. It was this silence, more than any single piece of evidence, that would come to define the investigation and the extended inquest that followed. A post-mortem examination was subsequently conducted on the body of Harriet Monckton. That examination established 2 findings of central importance to the case. The first was that she was approximately 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. The second was that the cause of her death was poisoning by prussic acid, a substance also known in the period and since as hydrogen cyanide. The specific medical practitioner who conducted the formal post-mortem examination is not named with confidence in the surviving accounts available for this record, and no name is supplied here in the absence of that confidence. The finding of poisoning by prussic acid was, however, well established and was not seriously contested during the subsequent proceedings. The nature of the poison used in Harriet Monckton's death carried a particular resonance within the small community of the chapel, given that one of the men named in connection with the case, George Verrill, was the minister of the chapel. Surgeons and medical men of the period frequently maintained access to a range of substances, including poisons used in professional practice, as a matter of the ordinary conduct of their trade. The surviving record does not establish that Verrill supplied, administered, or had any specific connection to the prussic acid that caused Monckton's death. It does not establish that his profession as a minister afforded him any special access to such substances. This is stated here as a feature of the era's medical trades, not as an inference of guilt, and no such inference is drawn from it. The discovery of Harriet Monckton's body within the grounds of the chapel she had attended only hours before produced an immediate and sustained reaction within Bromley. A young, unmarried, and by most contemporary accounts respectable member of a prominent local congregation had been found dead by poisoning and was found, upon examination, to have been carrying a child at the time of her death. The scandal attached to this combination of circumstances was considerable by the standards of the period, and it ensured that the case drew sustained attention from the local and, in time, the wider press, an attention that would persist across the several years the case remained formally open. The investigation into Harriet Monckton's death began in the days immediately following the discovery of her body. In 1843, England did not yet possess the organised structures of criminal detection that would develop across the remainder of the Victorian period. The Metropolitan Police's detective branch, formed only the previous year, was based in London and was not, as a matter of routine practice, the primary instrument of investigation in a market town such as Bromley. The principal mechanism by which such a death was investigated in this period was the coroner's inquest, supplemented by such inquiries as local constables and parish officers were able to conduct. A file relating to the case does survive within the records of the Metropolitan Police, catalogued as MEPO 348, indicating some degree of metropolitan interest or involvement in the matter, though Bromley itself sat at the edge of, rather than squarely within, the Metropolitan Police's core jurisdiction during this period. In the earliest days of the investigation, local officers and chapel officials undertook the initial work of establishing the circumstances of Monckton's final movements. Members of the congregation who had attended the prayer meeting on the evening of the 6th of November were asked to account for what they had observed of Monckton during that meeting and after its conclusion. This process of gathering statements from those present at the chapel formed the foundation of the case as it would be presented at the inquest that followed. The privy in which the body was discovered was examined, as was the surrounding chapel yard, though the surviving record does not preserve a detailed account of what, if anything, was recovered from the scene beyond the body itself. As the investigation proceeded, attention within the town, and subsequently within the formal proceedings of the inquest, turned to the question of who might have fathered Harriet Monckton's unborn child, and whether that same person might bear responsibility for her death. This line of inquiry led investigators and the coroner's officers to examine the conduct and associations of several men known to Monckton through the chapel community, among them Thomas Churcher and George Verrill. Both men were questioned regarding their relationship with Monckton, their whereabouts on the evening and night of the 6th of November, and any knowledge they might possess of her condition or her state of mind in the period preceding her death. Thomas Churcher a shoemaker by trade and a figure within the chapel's circle of acquaintance, was examined at length in the course of the proceedings that followed Monckton's death. The surviving record establishes that he had been walking out with Monckton in the weeks before her death, despite being engaged to another woman, Emma Milstead. He was named in contemporary accounts as a person of interest to the investigation, and his testimony and conduct were subject to sustained local speculation in the years that followed, particularly within the town of Bromley itself, where his name remained attached to the case long after the formal proceedings concluded without resolution. George Verrill, the minister named in connection with the case, was likewise examined by those conducting the investigation. His position as the chapel's minister placed him at the centre of the investigation, given that the death occurred within his own congregation and on chapel grounds. As with Churcher, the surviving record does not establish the specific nature of his relationship with Monckton beyond their mutual connection to the chapel community, nor does it establish that he possessed any specific knowledge of or involvement in the circumstances of her death. He too remained a named figure of suspicion within the town without ever facing formal charge. Beyond the two men most prominently named in surviving accounts, other members of the chapel congregation were examined as witnesses in the course of the investigation and the inquest that followed. Their specific identities are not consistently preserved across the sources available for this record, and no names beyond those already established are supplied here. What is documented is that the investigation drew upon the testimony of a number of individuals connected to the chapel, each asked to account for what they knew of Monckton, her circumstances, and her movements on the night in question, in an effort to reconstruct a sequence of events that the surviving record ultimately failed to establish with certainty. The investigation into Harriet Monckton's death, considered as a whole, was conducted within the constraints typical of a market town in 1843, relying on local testimony, the coroner's authority, and such medical evidence as the post-mortem examination could provide, rather than on the more developed investigative techniques that would emerge in policing later in the century. Officers and officials gathered what statements could be obtained from those present at the chapel and from those named in connection with Monckton's personal circumstances. No physical evidence beyond the medical findings is documented with confidence in the surviving record as having directly implicated any individual. The investigation, despite its sustained efforts across an unusually long period, did not succeed in identifying a person or persons responsible for her death. The medical examination of Harriet Monckton's body established the two central facts upon which the subsequent proceedings would turn. Her death was found to have resulted from the ingestion of prussic acid, a fast-acting poison capable of causing death within a short period following administration. The examination further established that she was approximately 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. These findings were presented in the course of the inquest and were not seriously disputed by any party to the proceedings. The examining medical evidence did not, however, extend to establishing how or by whom the poison had come to be administered, nor did it resolve the question of whether Monckton had taken the substance herself or had it administered to her by another. The post-mortem findings, considered together with the location and circumstances in which the body was discovered, shaped the direction that public and official speculation would take in the months and years that followed. The presence of a fatal dose of prussic acid in the body of a pregnant, unmarried woman found in the privy of the chapel she had attended hours earlier suggested, to many contemporaries, a case in which the concealment of the pregnancy itself might have supplied a motive for murder. This interpretation, common in press accounts and local discussion of the period, is presented here as the framework contemporaries reached for at the time, rather than as a finding established by the surviving evidence. The record does not establish who administered the poison, or that it was administered by another hand at all, with the certainty that would allow either possibility to be stated as fact. The reflection that emerges from the investigation and medical examination, taken together, is one of a case built upon careful documentation of what could be established and an equally careful, though ultimately unsuccessful, effort to determine what could not. The cause of death was clear. The condition of the deceased was clear. The identity of any person responsible was not established, despite the sustained attention of local officials, the coroner's inquest, and, per the surviving Metropolitan Police file, some measure of wider official interest in the matter. The coroner's inquest into the death of Harriet Monckton was convened in the days following the discovery of her body in November 1843. Inquests of this period were conducted before a coroner and a jury drawn from the local community, with the purpose of determining the cause of death and, where the evidence permitted, the circumstances and responsibility attaching to it. The inquest into Monckton's death proved unusual in its duration. Rather than concluding within the customary span of days or weeks typical of such proceedings, it was repeatedly adjourned and reopened across a period that extended to nearly 3 years from the date of the original discovery. Witnesses examined in the course of the inquest included members of the chapel congregation who had known Monckton, along with Thomas Churcher and George Verrill, both of whom were called to give account of their relationship to her and their movements on the night of her death. The surviving depositions from these proceedings, drawn upon in later research into the case, preserve some portion of the testimony given, though the full record of witness statements is not available in complete form for this account. The coroner's jury heard evidence regarding the medical findings, the circumstances of the discovery of the body, and the testimony of those who had seen Monckton on the evening of the 6th of November. The protracted nature of the inquest reflected, in itself, the evidentiary difficulty the case presented to those responsible for resolving it. Repeated adjournment over a period approaching 3 years was not a common feature of inquests of this era, and its occurrence in the Monckton case stands as a documented and distinctive element of the proceedings, indicating that the coroner and jury found themselves unable to reach a verdict that satisfied the evidence before them within any of the ordinary timeframes such matters were expected to occupy. The case remained, throughout this period, a subject of continued interest in the local and wider press. Sustaining public attention across the several years the inquest remained open. At the conclusion of this extended process, the coroner's jury returned a verdict of willful murder by a person or persons unknown. This verdict established, as a matter of formal record, that Harriet Monckton had been unlawfully killed, while declining to attach responsibility to any named individual. No person was committed for trial in connection with her death. The verdict, arrived at only after nearly 3 years of intermittent proceedings, marked the formal conclusion of the coroner's inquiry into the case, though it resolved none of the central questions that had occupied the town and the press since the discovery of her body. The absence of any committal for trial meant that no criminal proceedings followed the conclusion of the inquest. Despite the sustained local suspicion attaching to both Thomas Churcher and George Verrill throughout the period of the investigation and inquest, neither man was ever formally charged with any offence in connection with Harriet Monckton's death, and neither stood before a criminal court. The absence of trial is a defining feature of this case, and the record must be stated plainly in these terms. No one was ever brought to trial for the murder of Harriet Monckton, and no one was ever convicted. The lack of any prosecution meant that the case never proceeded to sentencing, and no question of imprisonment or execution arises in its record. The inquest's verdict of willful murder by a person or persons unknown stands within the surviving official record as the final formal determination reached in the matter. In the years following the conclusion of the inquest, the case continued to attract local attention, sustained in part by the memory of its unusually long proceedings and in part by the enduring absence of any resolution to the central question of who, if anyone, had been responsible for Harriet Monckton's death. The aftermath of the case within Bromley itself was shaped by the tension between a close, respectable, nonconformist community and the scandal of an unsolved death within its midst, compounded by the circumstances of the pregnancy that the post-mortem examination had revealed. Contemporary press coverage across Kent, and to some extent in London, followed the case through its lengthy inquest proceedings, reporting on each adjournment and reopening as it occurred. This sustained coverage ensured that the case remained within public memory for a period considerably longer than most local matters of the era, even as it failed to produce the resolution that might otherwise have allowed it to pass more quickly from attention. The record of Harriet Monckton's death, as it survives today, rests primarily upon three bodies of material. The National Archives holds a Metropolitan Police file relating to the case, catalogued as MEPO 348, indicating a degree of official interest beyond the purely local proceedings conducted by the Bromley coroner. Local historical research, including material associated with the Friends of Bromley local chapel, has preserved detail concerning the figures connected to the case, including the correct identification of Thomas Church's occupation as a shoemaker. And in 2018, the case received its most substantial modern treatment in a book-length account by Elizabeth Haynes, drawing upon surviving inquest depositions to reconstruct the case in fuller detail than had previously been available to general readers. Beyond this modern account, the case of Harriet Monckton has not entered wider British cultural memory. It has not been the subject of theatrical treatment, film or ballad in the manner of some of the era's more widely remembered crimes. Its persistence rests almost entirely within specialist and local history circles in and around Bromley, Kent, among those with a particular interest in Victorian-era poisonings that were never resolved. Within these circles, the case retains a documented significance both for the unusual length of its inquest proceedings and for the questions it raises about the investigative limitations of the period in which it occurred. The historical legacy of the case, considered in the fullest terms the surviving record allows, is bound up with the particular moment in which it occurred, 6 years into the reign of Queen Victoria, and at a point when the organised structures of criminal detection that would come to characterise later Victorian policing were still in their earlier stages of development. The Bromley investigation relied upon the coroner's inquest as its principal instrument, supplemented by such local inquiry as constables and chapel officials were able to conduct, in a manner typical of investigations of this period outside the metropolis. The case stands as a documented instance of the evidentiary difficulty such investigations could encounter, particularly where the crime in question left behind no witnesses to the act itself, and where suspicion, however sustained, could not be converted into the certainty a criminal charge required. The social context surrounding Harriet Monckton's death was shaped substantially by the standards of conduct expected within a nonconformist religious community of the period. Congregationalist chapels of the 1840s placed considerable emphasis on the moral character of their members, and an unmarried pregnancy discovered within such a community carried a weight of social consequence that extended well beyond the personal circumstances of the individual concerned. This context supplied for contemporaries examining the case an interpretive frame in which the concealment of the pregnancy might have furnished a motive for murder, a theory that circulated widely in the press, and in local discussion throughout the period the inquest remained open. This is presented here as the lens through which the era itself approached the case, and not as a conclusion drawn from any evidence that has survived to establish it as fact. The chapel community, of which Harriet Monckton was a part, continued its life and its worship in the years following her death, even as the case associated with it remained unresolved in the formal record. The privy behind the chapel, the site of the discovery of her body, remained a fixture of the chapel grounds. Through the years, the inquest continued to sit, a quiet, unremarkable structure that had become, through the events of a single November night, the location most closely associated with one of the district's more enduring unsolved cases. The record available for this account does not establish where Harriet Monckton was subsequently buried, and no claim is made here regarding the location or date of her interment. The extended timeline of the inquest, spanning nearly 3 years from the discovery of the body to the return of the final verdict, distinguishes the Monckton case from many others of its period, in which such proceedings were typically concluded within a considerably shorter span. This protracted process reflects the genuine difficulty the coroner and jury faced in reconciling the available evidence with any conclusion sufficient to identify responsibility for her death. It is a feature of the case worth stating plainly, as it speaks directly to the limits of what the investigation, however sustained, was ultimately able to establish. The chapel's weekday prayer meetings, of the kind Harriet Monckton attended on the evening of her death, were a regular feature of nonconformist religious practice in this period, distinct from the principal Sunday services and typically smaller in attendance, drawing together the more committed members of the congregation for a shorter and more intimate form of worship. Such meetings were held in the early evening, concluding while there was still some daylight remaining in the summer months, but well after dark by the time November arrived. The congregation that gathered on the evening of the 6th of November would have dispersed into streets lit only intermittently, making their way to their respective homes and lodgings through a market town that by that hour offered little in the way of illumination beyond what individual households or businesses provided. The surviving accounts of the case describe Bromley's independent chapel as a modest structure, serving a congregation whose numbers, while not extensively documented, were sufficient to sustain the reputation of respectability that surrounding accounts consistently attached to it and to its members. Harriet Monckton's standing within this congregation, described in local history sources as that of a well-regarded young woman, made the eventual revelation of her pregnancy and the manner of her death all the more difficult for the community to absorb. The chapel, as an institution, found itself at the centre of a criminal case not through any documented wrongdoing on its own part, but through its position as the last place at which Monckton was seen alive, and the site, in its own grounds, at which her body was found. The press coverage that attended the case throughout its long duration was substantial by the standards applied to a market town death of this period. Newspapers in Kent followed the case closely from the earliest reports of the discovery of the body, and coverage extended at various points across the nearly 3 years. The inquest remained open to papers with a wider circulation beyond the county. Each adjournment of the inquest and each reopening of the proceedings provided occasion for renewed reporting, ensuring that the case was rarely absent from public discussion for any extended period during the years it remained formally unresolved. This sustained coverage reflected both the scandal inherent in the circumstances of Monckton's death and the unusual length of the legal process that followed it, a combination that made the case a matter of continuing interest well beyond the immediate vicinity of Bromley. The town of Bromley itself, in the years following 1843, continued to grow gradually as a market centre serving the surrounding Kent countryside, its high street retaining much the same character it had held at the time of Monckton's death. The chapel continued its regular pattern of worship, and the privy behind it remained. Through the years, the inquest sat, a structure whose ordinary function stood in persistent tension with its association with an unresolved death. Local memory of the case, sustained initially by press coverage and later by the continued interest of local historians, kept the names of Harriet Monckton, Thomas Churcher, and George Verrill attached to the town's history long after the formal proceedings had concluded without resolution. Cases of unsolved poisoning were not without precedent in England during this period, though the particular combination of circumstances present in the Monckton case, an unmarried pregnant woman connected to a respectable religious congregation, found dead within the grounds of her own place of worship, gave it a character distinct from many contemporaneous matters. Poisoning as a method of killing carried, in the public imagination of the 1840s, associations with concealment and premeditation that violence of a more immediate kind did not, in part because it required access to a specific substance and some degree of opportunity to administer it without detection. George Verrall's position as the chapel's minister in a case that turned upon a poisoning contributed to the persistence of suspicion surrounding him specifically, even though the surviving record does not establish that he supplied or administered the substance found in Monckton's body. The question of how widely Harriet Monckton's pregnancy was known within the chapel congregation prior to her death remains, as the record stands, unresolved. Some contemporary accounts suggest that her condition may have been suspected or partially known among certain members of her circle, while others suggest that it came as a considerable shock to the wider congregation upon its revelation at the post-mortem examination. The surviving evidence does not permit a confident determination of which of these possibilities more accurately reflect the circumstances as they stood in early November of 1843, and no such determination is offered here. Thomas Church's continued association with the case in local memory owes a considerable debt to the persistence of local historical interest in Bromley itself, an interest reflected in later research that has sought to correct inaccuracies that accumulated around his role in the case over the years since 1843. Among these corrections is his occupation, which some accounts have rendered inaccurately, but which the more carefully researched local record establishes as that of a shoemaker, a tradesman's occupation consistent with the social standing of many members of a nonconformist congregation of this period. His examination in the course of the investigation and inquest reflected his known association with Monckton through the chapel, rather than any documented evidence directly connecting him to the substance that caused her death. George Verrall's position within the case, as the chapel's minister, examined in connection with a death that occurred within his own congregation, placed him under a particular form of scrutiny that was almost unavoidable, given the circumstances of the death. The surviving record does not indicate that Verrall's examination during the investigation or the inquest produced evidence directly implicating him in the administration of the poison, and the absence of any charge against him must be read alongside the absence of any charge against Churcher, as reflecting the coroner's jury's ultimate inability to attach responsibility to any named individual, rather than as an indication that either man was formally exonerated in any legal sense. The eventual verdict of willful murder by a person or persons unknown, returned after nearly 3 years of intermittent proceedings, left the case in a formal state that would persist without alteration into the historical record. No subsequent reopening of the investigation is documented in the sources available for this account, and no new evidence is recorded as having come to light in the years immediately following the conclusion of the inquest that might have altered its outcome. The case passed, in this state, from a matter of active investigation into one of historical record, its central question unanswered. The reflection to be drawn from the trial's absence, and from the verdict that closed the coroner's proceedings, is that the case of Harriet Monckton stands as a documented instance in which the investigative and evidentiary tools available to a market town coroner and jury in the 1840s proved insufficient to resolve a death that had occurred without witnesses within a community whose own standards of respectability may have limited what its members were prepared to disclose. The extended length of the inquest testifies to the seriousness with which the matter was treated by those responsible for investigating it, even as it underscores the limits of what that investigation was ultimately able to establish. In the decades that followed, the case of Harriet Monckton receded from wider public attention, remaining chiefly a matter of interest within Bromley, and among those engaged in the study of the town's local history. The National Archives' preservation of the Metropolitan Police file relating to the case ensured that an official record of the matter survived, available to later researchers seeking to reconstruct the details of an investigation that had, in its own time, occupied the attention of an entire county for the better part of 3 years. The absence of a resolution did not diminish the completeness of the documentary record, which preserved the medical findings, the substance of witness testimony so far as it survives, and the formal verdict returned by the coroner's jury. Elizabeth Haynes's 2018 account of the case drew upon these surviving depositions to present the fullest modern reconstruction of the Monckton case available to general readers, situating the investigation and inquest within the broader context of early Victorian nonconformist community life, and the particular evidentiary challenges such a case presented to the coroner's process of the period. This work, together with the continued research associated with local historical societies in Bromley, has ensured that the case, while never achieving wide national recognition, has not been entirely lost to the historical record, preserved instead as a documented example of an early Victorian death that resisted resolution despite sustained formal inquiry. The case of Harriet Monckton, considered in its entirety, rests upon a foundation of established fact surrounded by a considerable margin of genuine uncertainty. It is established that she died from poisoning by prussic acid on the night of the 6th of November 1843, that she was approximately 6 months pregnant at the time, that her body was discovered the following morning in the privy behind the chapel she had attended hours before, and that an inquest, extending across nearly 3 years, concluded with a verdict of willful murder by a person or persons unknown. It is not established who fathered her child, who administered the poison that killed her, or what occurred in the hours between her departure from the chapel and the discovery of her body. These unresolved questions remain within the surviving record, exactly as the coroner's jury left them in 1846, unanswered and unassigned. The investigation was formally closed in 1846 with the return of the coroner's inquest verdict. No conviction followed. The case remains open in the historical record. The detection of prussic acid within a body examined some hours or days after death required particular medical skill on the part of the examining practitioner, and the methods available to a provincial surgeon in 1843 for establishing such a finding rested upon a combination of physical observation and chemical testing that had only in recent years achieved a reasonable degree of reliability. Prussic acid, being volatile, could evade detection if too much time had elapsed between death and examination, and its identification depended upon tests for the characteristic odour associated with the substance, together with chemical procedures capable of confirming its presence where the odour alone might be disputed or have faded. That the examining medical evidence in the Monckton case was able to establish poisoning by prussic acid with sufficient confidence to be accepted by the coroner's jury indicates that the examination was conducted with reasonable promptness following the discovery of the body, though the precise interval between death and examination is not preserved with certainty in the sources available for this account. The chemical analysis required to confirm a finding of prussic acid poisoning in this period typically fell to a surgeon or apothecary with some grounding in toxicology, a specialism that was, in 1843, still developing as a distinct branch of medical practice in England. Cases of this kind frequently drew upon the same small body of practitioners across a county, individuals whose testimony before a coroner's jury carried particular weight given the technical nature of the evidence they were asked to interpret. The jury itself, composed of local men, without medical training, depended upon such testimony being presented in terms sufficiently plain to allow a lay body to reach a confident conclusion regarding cause of death, even where the finer chemical detail of the analysis lay beyond their own expertise. The privy in which Harriet Monckton's body was found occupied an unremarkable place within the ordinary function of the chapel grounds, a structure of the kind attached to nearly every public building of the period that lacked more modern sanitary provision. Such structures were typically built of brick or timber, unheated and unlit, situated at some distance from the main building for reasons of both practicality and decency, and reached by a path that would, on a November evening, have been in near or complete darkness by the conclusion of a prayer meeting. The ordinary use of such a structure by members of the congregation before departing for their homes meant that its rear approach was a place any attendee might have occasion to visit in the course of an evening's worship, a fact that bears directly upon the difficulty investigators faced in reconstructing who might have had opportunity to encounter Monckton there, or to have arranged to meet her there, without arousing particular notice among the other worshippers dispersing into the night. The darkness of a Bromley evening in early November, compounded by the limited and irregular provision of street lighting in a market town of this size, meant that the movements of any individual departing the chapel grounds after the conclusion of the prayer meeting would have been difficult for witnesses to observe with precision. A congregation dispersing from an evening meeting did so gradually, individuals and small groups making their way in different directions toward their respective homes, lodgings, and places of business. A pattern of departure that would have made it entirely possible for a single individual to remain behind, or to return briefly to the chapel grounds, without this being remarked upon by those already some distance along the High Street. This circumstance forms part of the explanation, though not a resolution, for why no witness came forward with an account of Monckton's final movements sufficient to establish what occurred after she was last seen among the departing congregation. The extended duration of the inquest, repeatedly adjourned across nearly 3 years, meant that the coroner and jury returned to the matter on numerous separate occasions. Each session an opportunity to examine further witnesses, reconsider testimony already given, and weigh whatever additional information had come to light since the proceedings had last sat. Each adjournment carried with it an implicit acknowledgement that the evidence before the jury remained insufficient to support a verdict naming a responsible party, and each reopening represented a renewed effort to close that gap. The cumulative effect of this pattern, sustained across years rather than weeks, was to keep the case before the public in a manner few inquests of the period achieved. The town of Bromley made repeatedly aware, through each fresh sitting, that the question of who had killed Harriet Monckton remained as open as it had been on the morning her body was discovered. For the members of the independent chapel congregation, the years during which the inquest remained open represented a sustained period in which their own community continued to be examined, in effect, alongside the specific individuals named in connection with the case. Witnesses called before the coroner on more than one occasion across these years would have found themselves repeatedly required to account for their recollection of a single evening, their answers measured against testimony given in earlier sessions, their standing within the congregation itself potentially affected by their proximity to a case that refused to resolve. The chapel's own function as a place of worship continued throughout this period, its ordinary services and meetings proceeding alongside the extraordinary and unresolved matter that had attached itself, through no fault of the institution, to its name. The distinction between Bromley, Kent, as it existed in 1843, and the administrative entity that would later bear a related name within the metropolitan boundaries of London, is a matter of some importance to the accurate understanding of the case's setting. In 1843, Bromley was a market town within the county of Kent, governed by its own local officials and possessing a character distinctly rural and provincial, by comparison with the rapidly expanding metropolis to its north. It would be several decades before processes of suburban growth and administrative reorganisation drew Bromley more closely into London's orbit. At the time of Harriet Monckton's death, the town's identity was that of a self-contained Kentish community, its chapel, its high street, and its surrounding countryside forming the entire world within which the case unfolded. The involvement of the Metropolitan Police, as reflected in the surviving file catalogued at the National Archives, sits somewhat uneasily against this provincial setting, since Bromley in 1843 lay at the margins of, rather than squarely within, the territory the Metropolitan Force was established to police. The existence of this file nonetheless indicates that the case attracted some degree of attention from authorities beyond the immediate jurisdiction of the local Kent Constabulary and the coroner's own officers, whether through formal request for assistance, the transmission of information, or some other form of official interest whose precise nature is not fully detailed in the summary of records available for this account. This detail is presented as a documented feature of the case's administrative history, without further claim as to the specific role the Metropolitan Force played in the investigation itself. The absence of an organised detective branch operating within Bromley itself meant that the burden of gathering evidence fell substantially upon the coroner's own process, a method of investigation structured around the taking of sworn testimony before a jury rather than the independent gathering of evidence by trained investigators in the manner that would become more common in criminal investigations later in the Victorian period. This structural feature of the case is worth stating plainly, since it explains a good deal about why an investigation sustained across nearly 3 years nonetheless failed to produce a name the jury felt able to attach to a verdict of murder. The coroner's inquest was designed to determine cause of death and, where possible, responsibility for it, but it was not equipped with the powers of search, surveillance, or sustained inquiry that a dedicated police investigation might have brought to bear upon a case of this complexity. Contemporary newspaper accounts of the case, appearing across the years the inquest remained open, frequently returned to the same central details with each fresh report. The pregnancy, the poison, the chapel, the 2 men named in connection with the matter, presented afresh to readers with each adjournment and reopening of the proceedings. This pattern of repeated coverage reflected both the genuine absence of new developments to report across long stretches of the case's history and the sustained public appetite for updates on a matter that combined scandal, religious respectability, and unresolved violence in a manner the press of the period found reliably compelling. Papers in Kent carried the most consistent coverage, given their proximity to Bromley and their readership's direct familiarity with the town and its chapel community, while papers of wider circulation took up the case at intervals, particularly at moments when the inquest returned to session after a period of dormancy. The social weight carried by an unmarried pregnancy within a Congregationalist community of this period cannot be separated from the broader speculation that attached itself to the case throughout its long history. Nonconformist congregations of the 1840s operated under a discipline that, in principle, if not always in strict practice, held members accountable to the judgment of their fellow worshippers for conduct considered inconsistent with the moral standards the congregation professed. A woman in Monckton's circumstances faced not only the practical difficulties attending an unmarried pregnancy in this period, but the prospect of standing before a community whose religious identity was itself bound up with expectations of visible, moral conduct. Whether this prospect bore directly upon the events of the 6th of November is not established by the surviving record, but it forms part of the social context within which contemporaries interpreted her death, and within which the theory of concealment as motive gained the currency it held throughout the period of public discussion that followed. The two men most closely associated with the case in the public mind, Thomas Churcher and George Verrill, each continued to reside within or near Bromley during the years the inquest remained open, their presence within the town a continual reminder to those who knew them of the case's unresolved status. The surviving record does not indicate that either man's daily life or trade was formally interrupted by the suspicion attached to his name, since neither was ever charged or detained in connection with the matter, but the persistence of local speculation across nearly 3 years of intermittent inquest proceedings would have made each man's position within the town a subject of continued, if informal, scrutiny among his neighbours and fellow congregants. This aspect of the case, while not preserved in the kind of documentary detail that would allow a fuller account of its effect on either man individually, forms a recognised feature of how unresolved suspicion operated within a small community of this period, where formal legal exoneration and informal social suspicion did not necessarily move in step with one another. The jury itself, drawn from the local population of Bromley and the surrounding district in the customary manner of coroner's inquests, bore across the nearly 3 years of the case's proceedings a considerable and unusual burden, required to weigh evidence presented across widely spaced sessions, to hold in memory testimony given months or years earlier, and ultimately to reach a conclusion that, however carefully considered, could not identify a party responsible for the death they had been convened to examine. The verdict of willful murder by a person or persons unknown, when it was finally returned, represented not a failure of diligence on the part of the coroner or jury, but an honest acknowledgement that the evidence gathered across the full course of the proceedings did not permit any more specific conclusion to be reached with the confidence the law required. The record of Harriet Monckton's death was entered in full before the coroner and his jury, sustained across nearly 3 years of testimony and adjournment, and closed at last with a verdict that named no one. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the second case ends. What follows is the third and final story gathered here, one that unfolded not in a chapel town, but in the quiet countryside, south of London, in a household given over to the care of a single married couple, where the ordinary duties of caretaking gave way, on one night in early summer, to a crime that a court would later examine and could not fully resolve. The case of Martha Halliday begins in Kingswood, a small parish near Reigate in the county of Surrey, in the summer of 1861. Kingswood in this period was a rural settlement lying within the North Downs, several miles south of Croydon and roughly 20 miles from central London, characterised by scattered farmsteads, wooded commons, and a small parish church served by a resident or visiting rector. The parish rectory itself, the residence attached to the incumbent clergyman's office, stood as one of the larger dwellings in the immediate vicinity, typically constructed of brick or stone, with several reception rooms, a kitchen and domestic offices, and ground sufficient to require regular maintenance. Surrey in 1861 remained substantially agricultural in its southern reaches, even as its northern parishes were increasingly drawn into the orbit of London through rail connections and suburban expansion, and Kingswood itself sat closer to the rural end of that spectrum, a place of hedgerows, commons, and dispersed dwellings rather than dense settlement. The nearest market town of consequence was Reigate, itself a modest county town rather than an industrial centre, and the parish of Kingswood depended for its administration and its ecclesiastical life on the structures of the Church of England, with the rector as the senior resident authority in matters both spiritual and, informally, social. It was standard practice within such parishes for a clergyman to employ a caretaker, sometimes styled a gardener or a groundsman, together with his wife, to reside at or near the rectory and to maintain the property, particularly during periods when the incumbent was absent from the parish. Absences of this kind were not unusual among Victorian clergy, who might travel for reasons of health, family obligation, or ecclesiastical business, and who relied on trusted domestic staff to preserve the fabric and security of the rectory in their absence. William Halliday served as parish clerk to the rector, the Reverend Taylor, at Kingswood, and it was his wife, Martha Halliday, who resided at the rectory under this arrangement, William himself keeping a cottage of his own in the churchyard nearby. In June of 1861, the Reverend Taylor was away from the parish, leaving the rectory, a substantial dwelling standing somewhat apart from its immediate neighbours, under the sole charge of Martha Halliday. The rectory's setting, common to many rural clergy residences of the period, meant that it did not benefit from close proximity to other occupied houses, and a household of only 2 persons, occupying a large property during the rector's absence represented, in retrospect, a position of some vulnerability, one that the events of that June would expose in the starkest terms. Very little is recorded of Martha Halliday's life before this period. No birth record, no maiden name, and no account of her family origins appear in the sources that document this case, and nothing is known with confidence of where she was born, where she was raised, or how she came to marry William Halliday. She was, at the time of her death, approximately 55 years of age, a figure drawn from the sources available rather than from any surviving certificate of birth or baptism, and this approximate age suggests a woman who had spent a considerable portion of her adult life in domestic service, or in the kind of caretaking work that she and her husband performed together at Kingswood. Couples engaged in this capacity were typically drawn from the ranks of agricultural or domestic labourers, individuals for whom a position, combining lodging with modest wages, represented a stable, if unglamorous livelihood, and nothing in the records suggests that the Halliday circumstances departed from this common pattern. What can be stated is that by June of 1861, Martha Halliday had been established at Kingswood Rectory long enough and closely enough to be entrusted with the care of a clergyman's household during his absence, a position that required a degree of trust and settled residence rather than any casual or temporary engagement. Beyond this, the record available for this account does not establish the details of her earlier life, her upbringing, or the circumstances of her marriage, and no invented particulars are offered in their place. The domestic routine of a rectory under the care of a couple such as the Hallidays would have followed a steady and largely unremarkable pattern. Days were occupied with the maintenance of the house and grounds, the tending of a garden that in a clergyman's residence often supplied vegetables and provided a setting for parish social occasions, and the general oversight of a property that, though empty of its principal occupant, still required regular attention to prevent decay or disorder. Evenings in such a household, particularly during the rector's absence, would have passed with comparatively little incident, the couple retiring to their own quarters, within or adjoining the main house, once the day's tasks were completed. The isolation inherent in this arrangement, a large house at some remove from other dwellings, occupied by only 2 persons, was not itself unusual for the period, and nothing in the surviving record suggests that the Hallidays regarded their situation as one of particular risk. Rural households of this kind operated for the most part without incident, their security resting on custom and on the general absence of serious crime in such settings rather than on any formal measures of protection, and the rectory at Kingswood in June of 1861 would have presented to any observer of the time an entirely ordinary picture of quiet parish life. On the evening of Monday, the 10th of June 1861, Martha Halliday was, so far as the surviving record establishes, occupied with the customary business of the household. The specific details of her final hours that evening, the particular tasks she undertook, the conversation she may have had with her husband, or the hour at which the household retired for the night, are not documented with any precision in the sources available for this account, and no such details are offered here beyond what can be stated plainly, that the evening began as an ordinary one within the rectory. During the course of that night, the rectory was entered by one or more persons unknown to the household, in circumstances consistent with a burglary, an intrusion undertaken for the purpose of theft rather than, so far as the surviving evidence indicates, any prior acquaintance with or specific animus toward the Hallidays themselves. In the course of this intrusion, Martha Halliday was overpowered. She was bound at the hands and feet, restraining her movement entirely, and she was gagged, a sock having been forced into her mouth to prevent her from crying out. A shirt was fastened around her neck, and a handkerchief was tied about her face, restraints that, taken together with the gag, resulted in her death by suffocation. The record does not establish with certainty who first discovered her, and this account does not assign that discovery to any specific individual beyond what the sources confirm, only that her body was found the following morning, Tuesday, the 11th of June, still bound and gagged as she had been left. The immediate circumstances surrounding the intrusion itself, insofar as they can be reconstructed from the surviving record, indicate a burglary that proceeded with some deliberation. Left at the scene were two items that would come to dominate the subsequent investigation. A bludgeon fashioned from beechwood, apparently intended for use as a weapon or as a means of intimidation during the course of the burglary, and a bundle of papers written in the German language. Neither item belonged to the household, and both were treated from the earliest stages of the inquiry as belonging to, or otherwise closely connected with, whoever had entered the rectory that night. The presence of the bludgeon indicated an intrusion prepared in advance for the possibility of confrontation, rather than one improvised entirely on the spot, while the papers, written in a language foreign to the immediate locality, suggested to the investigators of the time a connection to one or more of the itinerant German labourers and vagrants known to pass through the southern counties of England in this period, seeking agricultural or casual work. It was this presumed connection between the papers left behind and the identity of whoever had carried them into the rectory that would shape the entire course of the investigation that followed, for reasons that would only become clear once the matter reached trial. The cause of Martha Halliday's death, as established in the surviving record, was suffocation, resulting directly from the manner in which she had been bound and gagged during the course of the burglary. The record available for this account does not provide extensive detail regarding the physician or physicians who examined her, nor does it preserve a full account of the post-mortem findings beyond this central fact, and no further particulars of the medical examination are asserted here beyond what the sources confirm. What can be stated with confidence, because it is consistent across the sources documenting this case, is that her death was not the result of a blow or a wound in the ordinary sense associated with violent assault, but rather the consequence of restraint itself, of a gag forced into her mouth and cloth drawn about her neck and face until she could no longer draw breath. This method, rather than resulting from any elaborate design, was consistent with a burglary in which the intruder or intruders sought above all to prevent an alarm being raised, binding and silencing the sole occupant capable of resistance or outcry with fatal consequence. The discovery of Martha Halliday's body on the morning of the 11th of June set in motion an investigation conducted by the local Surrey Constabulary. The county force established in the preceding decades under the reforms that had extended organised policing beyond the metropolis and into England's rural counties. Officers attending the scene at Kingswood Rectory were confronted with a household in which the sole female occupant had been killed in the course of an apparent burglary. Her husband, William Halliday, presumably present within the property at the time, though the precise sequence of his own movements that night and his own account of events are not preserved in detail within the sources available for this account. The investigation's earliest and most consequential line of inquiry centred on the two items left behind at the scene, the beechwood bludgeon and the bundle of papers written in German, both of which were treated as evidence pointing directly toward the identity of the person or persons responsible. Given the presence of German-language documents and given the known presence of itinerant German labourers and vagrants in the vicinity of Surrey and the surrounding counties during this period, investigating officers turned their attention toward this population, seeking to establish whether any individual among them could be connected to the papers found at the rectory. This inquiry proceeded with some care, given the nature of the population involved, itinerant labourers who moved frequently between counties and who, unlike settled residents, could not always be located again once a district's constabulary had turned its attention elsewhere. Investigating officers gathered accounts from those who had encountered German vagrants in the vicinity of Reigate and the surrounding parishes in the days preceding the murder, and this process of inquiry eventually produced the name of a man who would be brought before the courts to answer for the crime, Johann Karl Franz. The papers found at the rectory were understood, in the earliest stages of the investigation, to belong to Franz or to be closely connected with him, and it was on this basis that officers proceeded to locate and detain him for questioning regarding the events of the night of the 10th of June. Statements were taken from those who could speak to Franz's movements and his known associations, and the beechwood bludgeon found at the scene was examined and preserved as an exhibit for the proceedings that would follow. The investigation, in its structure and its method, followed the pattern common to cases of this kind in the period, proceeding from physical evidence recovered at the scene toward the identification of a suspect, rather than from any direct witness to the crime itself, for no such witness existed among the living. The pursuit of Franz as a suspect brought investigating officers into contact with a wider circle of German labourers known to be moving through the district that summer, and it was through this wider inquiry that two further names entered the record: Krohn and Gerstenberg. These two men were understood, through evidence that would later be presented at trial, to have had some connection to the papers found at the rectory, a connection that would ultimately prove more direct and more troubling for the prosecution's case than investigators appreciated when the inquiry was first directed toward Franz. The precise sequence by which officers came to identify Krohn and Gerstenberg, and the extent to which they were formally questioned or pursued as suspects in their own right, is not established with clarity in the sources available for this account, and this narrative does not assert particulars beyond what the record confirms: that both men were named in connection with the case, and that neither was ultimately brought to trial for it. The investigation, having settled upon Franz as the man to be charged, proceeded toward committal, and it was Franz alone who would stand before the Central Criminal Court to answer for the murder of Martha Halliday. A coroner's inquest, the formal legal inquiry required under English law to establish the cause and circumstances of a sudden or violent death, would have preceded the committal of any suspect for trial, in accordance with standard procedure of the period. The specific details of this inquest as it pertained to Martha Halliday, including the name of the presiding coroner, the precise dates on which it was convened, and the exact wording of the verdict returned, are not preserved in the sources available for this account, and no such particulars are asserted here in their absence. What can be stated with confidence is that the process of inquest and committal did result in Johann Karl Franz being charged with the murder and sent forward for trial at the Croydon Assizes, a sequence that presupposes an inquest verdict sufficient to support that committal, even though the surviving record does not preserve the inquest's own language or its date. The investigation into Martha Halliday's death, from the discovery of her body at Kingswood Rectory on the 11th of June, through to the committal of Franz, thus proceeded along lines familiar to the county's criminal justice apparatus of the period, moving from physical evidence at the scene, through the identification and detention of a suspect connected to that evidence, toward a formal criminal charge. The trial of Johann Karl Franz for the murder of Martha Halliday was held at the Central Criminal Court. the senior criminal court sitting at the Old Bailey in London, a venue that held jurisdiction over serious offences committed not only within the metropolis itself, but also within the surrounding home counties, including Surrey, under arrangements established earlier in the century. It was therefore not unusual that a murder committed in a rural parish south of London should be tried not before the Surrey Assizes, but at the Central Criminal Court in the capital, a procedural detail reflecting the court's extended jurisdiction rather than any unusual feature of the case itself. The trial took place in 1861, though the precise date within that year is not established with certainty in the sources available for this account. Franz stood before the court on a charge of murder, to which he entered a plea of not guilty, and he was defended by counsel identified in the surviving record only by the surname Denman, a barrister whose fuller identity is not established with confidence in the sources consulted for this account, and is not asserted here beyond that surname. The case presented against Franz by the prosecution rested substantially upon the two items recovered from the scene of the crime: the beechwood bludgeon and the bundle of papers written in the German language, both of which were presented to the court as evidence connecting the defendant to the burglary and the death that had resulted from it. The prosecution's argument proceeded on the understanding that the papers being in Franz's hand or otherwise closely associated with him established his presence at Kingswood Rectory on the night in question, and that the bludgeon found alongside them further implicated him in the violence that had been done to Martha Halliday. This line of evidence, circumstantial in its nature, depended entirely upon the papers being reliably traceable to Franz as their owner, and by extension, as the person who had carried them into the rectory and left them there in the course of the burglary. It was precisely this chain of reasoning that the defence would proceed to challenge, and the challenge, when it came, proved sufficient to unravel the prosecution's case in its entirety. Counsel for the defence presented evidence at trial establishing that the papers found at the scene, far from having been carried into the rectory by Franz himself, had in fact been stolen from him prior to the murder by two other men, the same Crone and Gerstenberg, who had earlier entered the investigation's record as associates connected to the case. If the papers had left Franz's possession before the night of the 10th of June, then their presence at the rectory could not reliably be taken as evidence of his own presence there, and the central plank of the prosecution's case, resting as it did upon the papers as a direct link between Franz and the scene of the crime, was substantially undermined. This defence, presented and evidently accepted by the jury in its essential outline, transformed the case from one in which physical evidence appeared to place a known individual at the scene of a murder into one in which that same evidence, properly understood, pointed instead toward two other men who had never been charged and who were not before the court to answer for the crime. The trial thus turned not on any question of an alibi for Franz's own movements on the night in question, nor on any defence grounded in his character or reputation, but specifically on the provenance of the papers themselves, and on the demonstration that they had passed out of his hands before the burglary took place. The jury, having heard the evidence presented by both prosecution and defence, returned a verdict of not guilty, and Johann Karl Franz was accordingly acquitted of the murder of Martha Halliday. This verdict meant that he was found not to have committed the offence with which he had been charged, and was released from custody without further proceedings against him in connection with this case. The acquittal represented, within the narrow terms of the trial itself, an instance in which the machinery of the criminal courts, having initially proceeded against a man on the strength of evidence that appeared compelling, ultimately declined to convict him once that evidence had been shown to rest on a mistaken premise. No sentence was passed, for none was warranted following an acquittal, and Franz's connection to the criminal justice system in relation to Martha Halliday's death ended with his discharge from the court, The sources available for this account do not establish what became of Franz following his acquittal, whether he remained in England or returned to the continent, and no such details are offered here in the absence of documentation. The two men implicated by the defence's evidence at trial, Crone and Gerstenberg, whose theft of the papers from Franz had formed the basis of his successful defence, were never brought before any court to answer for the murder of Martha Halliday. The sources available for this account do not establish whether either man was formally questioned by investigating officers following the trial, whether either was located and detained at any point, or what became of either man in the years that followed. Their connection to the case rests upon the evidentiary logic presented at Franz's trial, that the papers found at the scene had passed through their hands before the burglary took place, a fact sufficient to raise substantial doubt as to Franz's own presence at the rectory, but insufficient, on the strength of the surviving record, to establish with certainty that either Crone or Gerstenberg had themselves entered the rectory on the night in question, or had caused the death of Martha Halliday. This account does not assert their guilt as an established fact, for the record does not permit such an assertion, and it states only that both men were named in connection with the case, and that neither was ever tried for it. The murder of Martha Halliday, following the acquittal of Franz and the absence of any further prosecution, remained without a conviction, and the identity of the person or persons who bound and gagged her on the night of the 10th of June, 1861, was never established through any subsequent legal proceeding. The absence of any conviction in the case of Martha Halliday's death did not follow from any deficiency in the investigation as it had been conducted, but rather from the specific circumstance that the evidence gathered, once tested at trial, pointed most strongly toward men who were never brought before the court. The acquittal of Johann Karl Franz stands, within the surviving record of this case, as an instance in which the correction of a mistaken accusation occurred within the proper course of legal proceedings. A man initially connected to a serious crime through circumstantial evidence was tried, and upon the presentation of evidence undermining that connection, was found not guilty and released. This outcome differs in a significant respect from cases in which an accused person is convicted upon evidence later shown to have been mistaken or insufficient, requiring years of subsequent appeal or a pardon to correct an injustice already inflicted through imprisonment or execution. In the case of Franz, the correction occurred within the trial itself, the jury declining to convict once the weakness in the prosecution's evidence had been demonstrated, and no period of wrongful imprisonment followed his acquittal. The record available for this account does not, however, permit any assessment of whether Franz's initial arrest and the period he spent in custody prior to trial caused him hardship, loss of livelihood, or damage to his standing, matters on which the surviving sources are silent. The wider suspicion that had fallen, in the earlier stages of the investigation, upon German labourers and vagrants generally, prior to the identification of Franz specifically, reflects attitudes toward foreign itinerant workers that were not uncommon in rural England during this period. Migrant agricultural labourers from the continent, including a number from the German states, moved through the southern counties of England in the middle decades of the 19th century in search of seasonal work, and their presence, though a familiar feature of the rural economy, was also sometimes met with suspicion, disproportionate to any evidence of wrongdoing on their part, particularly at moments when a serious crime had occurred in a district through which such labourers were known to pass. The discovery of German language papers at the scene of Martha Halliday's murder placed this general suspicion on a specific footing, directing the investigation toward the German labouring population resident or transient in the vicinity of Kingswood in the summer of 1861, a direction of inquiry that, whatever its basis in the physical evidence recovered, also reflected the broader readiness of the period to regard foreign itinerants as likely suspects in cases of rural crime. The trial's outcome, in demonstrating that the papers had been stolen from France, rather than carried by him into the rectory, did not resolve this wider question of suspicion so much as redirect it toward two further individuals, themselves also German, who were likewise never convicted of any offence in connection with the case. William Halliday, whose wife had been killed in the rectory that the two of them had together been entrusted to care for, is not further documented in the sources available for this account beyond his role as caretaker and gardener, and as the husband of Martha Halliday. Nothing is recorded of his own account of the night of the 10th of June, of his whereabouts within the rectory at the time his wife was overpowered, or of the circumstances under which her body came to be discovered the following morning. Nothing is recorded either of the course of his life in the years following her death, whether he remained in the employment of the parish, whether he continued to reside at Kingswood, or how he supported himself in the absence of the wife with whom he had shared this position of trust. The Reverend Taylor, the rector of Kingswood, in whose absence the burglary and murder took place, is likewise documented in the surviving sources only by surname and by his position as incumbent of the parish, without further detail of his given name, his tenure, or his response upon learning of the death of the woman who had been entrusted with the care of his household during his absence. These gaps in the record are characteristic of a case in which the surviving documentation centres overwhelmingly on the criminal proceedings themselves, the investigation, the trial, and the acquittal, while the lives of those most directly affected by the crime, the victim's husband and the household in whose service she died, remain largely outside the reach of the sources consulted for this account. The murder of Martha Halliday and the subsequent trial and acquittal of Johann Karl Franz attracted attention in the local press of Surrey and the surrounding counties at the time. Given the unusual circumstances of a burglary resulting in death within a clergyman's household, and given the further unusual circumstance of a trial that turned so decisively upon the theft of papers from the very man initially suspected of the crime, the specific content of contemporary press coverage, including any particular reporting of public reaction to the verdict, is not preserved in detail within the sources available for this account, and this narrative accordingly confines itself to the observation that a case of this nature, involving a violent death in a rural rectory and a trial that unravelled its own central evidence in open court, would very plausibly have generated comment in the regional newspapers of the period, without asserting the specific content or tenor of that comment beyond what the surviving record supports. The absence of a named party ultimately held responsible for Martha Halliday's death meant that the case, from the perspective of the contemporary public record, closed not with the resolution ordinarily expected of a capital trial, but with an acquittal that left the central question of the case, who had entered the rectory and caused her death, unanswered. In the century and more that followed, the case of Martha Halliday did not retain a place in the wider national memory of Victorian crime in the manner of more celebrated cases of the period. It has, however, persisted within the specific traditions of Surrey local history, where it has been treated as a feature of the county's 19th century record, drawing on the surviving newspaper accounts and trial documentation to reconstruct the events at Kingswood Rectory for a modern local readership. The case has also received attention in later published surveys of overlooked Victorian murder cases, most notably in the work of the historian Jan Bonderson, whose study Rivals of the Ripper examined a number of 19th century murder cases that had, in his assessment, been overshadowed in the popular imagination by the fame attached to the Whitechapel murders of 1888, despite possessing their own substantial and, in some instances, more fully resolved evidentiary records. Within such treatments, the case of Martha Halliday has been presented as an instructive example of a Victorian investigation that proceeded methodically from physical evidence to a named suspect only for that evidence once tested at trial, to point toward an outcome its investigators had not anticipated. Beyond this local and specialist treatment, the case has not been the subject of dramatization, ballad, or wider popular retelling, and its persistence in the historical record rests principally upon the county history tradition and upon this more recent scholarly attention to cases of its kind. The broader context in which Martha Halliday's death occurred was one in which the machinery of criminal investigation across England's counties had, by 1861, developed a settled institutional form, county constabularies operating under the reforms of preceding decades, working in conjunction where necessary with the county's own assize courts, such as that at Croydon, for the trial of serious offences arising within their jurisdiction. This institutional structure permitted a case such as this one, a burglary and killing in a rural Surrey parish, to be investigated by local officers and tried before the Central Criminal Court in London, a jurisdictional arrangement reflecting the ordinary course of the criminal justice system, rather than any unusual feature of the crime's location. The methods available to investigators in 1861 relied substantially upon the interpretation of physical evidence recovered at the scene of a crime, in this instance the beechwood bludgeon and the bundle of papers, in the absence of the more developed forensic techniques that would become available to police in later decades. The case of Martha Halliday illustrates both the strengths and the limitations of this approach. Evidence recovered at the scene did lead investigators to a named suspect and a full trial, yet the same evidence, subjected to closer scrutiny by the defence, proved insufficient to sustain a conviction, leaving the actual circumstances of the burglary and the identity of those responsible for Martha Halliday's death unresolved at the conclusion of the proceedings. The arrangement by which a clergyman's household was placed in the keeping of a caretaker couple during his absence, the arrangement under which the Hallidays lived and worked at Kingswood Rectory, was a common feature of parish life across rural England in this period, reflecting the practical needs of the Church of England's parochial system, in which incumbents required trusted domestic staff to maintain their residences during periods away from the parish. Such arrangements depended upon a degree of isolation inherent to many rectory settings, properties often standing somewhat apart from the body of a village or hamlet, and upon a general assumption of security resting on custom rather than on any formal protective measures. The events of June 1861 at Kingswood exposed the vulnerability latent within this otherwise unremarkable domestic arrangement. A substantial house occupied by only 2 persons, at some distance from immediate neighbours, becoming the setting for a burglary in which the sole occupant capable of raising an alarm was bound, gagged, and left to suffocate. Nothing in the surviving record suggests that this vulnerability was recognised or addressed prior to the events of that night, and the case stands within the local history of Surrey as evidence of the risks attending such caretaking arrangements, even in a period and a locality not otherwise associated with serious crime. The verdict returned in Franz's case. Acquittal meant specifically that he had been tried before a jury on the charge brought against him and found not guilty, a legal outcome distinct from a finding of factual innocence in any absolute sense, but one that carried the full force of the law in releasing him from further liability for the offence charged. Under the criminal procedure of the period, as under English law more broadly, an acquitted defendant could not be tried a second time for the same offence, a protection that meant Franz's connection to the case, once the jury had returned its verdict, was concluded as a matter of law regardless of whatever private suspicions may have persisted among those who had followed the proceedings. This finality, attaching to an acquittal, stood in contrast to the continuing, unresolved status of the underlying crime itself. For while Franz's own legal position was settled beyond further challenge, the question of who had in fact entered Kingswood Rectory on the night of the 10th of June and caused the death of Martha Halliday remained, and remains, without an answer, supported by any subsequent conviction. Cases of burglary resulting in the death of a solitary or vulnerable occupant were not unknown elsewhere in England during the middle decades of the 19th century, and the pattern exhibited at Kingswood, an isolated dwelling, an occupant overpowered and restrained rather than killed by a direct blow, and physical evidence left behind by intruders who did not anticipate its evidentiary significance, recurred in other rural districts where households depended on a small number of resident staff for their security. What distinguished the Kingswood case within this broader pattern was less the manner of the crime itself than the particular evidentiary reversal that occurred at trial, in which the very evidence that had led investigators to Franz was shown through the efforts of the defence to implicate two other men more directly, without those men ever being brought to answer for it. This outcome, an acquittal secured not through an alibi or a challenge to witness credibility, but through a demonstrated flaw in the chain of physical evidence, represented a particular kind of legal resolution, one in which the trial process functioned precisely as intended in preventing the conviction of a man. The evidence did not, on close examination, actually implicate, while leaving the broader question of responsibility for the crime unresolved. The rectory at Kingswood itself, as a physical setting, continued in its function as the residence of the parish's incumbent clergyman in the years following the murder, the sources available for this account offering no indication that the building was abandoned, demolished, or altered in consequence of the events of June 1861. Rural parishes of this period rarely allowed the sight of even a serious crime to interrupt the ordinary continuity of parochial life for any extended period, and there is no reason, on the basis of the surviving record, to suppose that Kingswood Rectory departed from this pattern, continuing to house successive incumbents and presumably successive arrangements for its care and maintenance in the years that followed. The specific fate of the rectory building itself in the decades after 1861, whether it remained in continuous use, was rebuilt, or was eventually superseded by a different arrangement for housing the parish's clergy, is not documented in the sources consulted for this account, and no such details are offered here in their absence. The broader question of how a case such as this one, possessing a full trial record at the Central Criminal Court, a named defendant, and a documented acquittal, came nonetheless to occupy so modest a place in the wider historical memory of Victorian crime, reflects less any deficiency in the documentation surrounding the case than the simple absence of the kind of dramatic closure, a conviction, a sentence, an execution that has tended in the popular imagination to fix certain cases of the period more firmly in public memory than others. A case that concludes in acquittal, leaving the underlying crime formally unsolved, offers a less immediately compelling narrative to a general audience than one that concludes with a clear verdict and a clear consequence, even where, as in the case of Martha Halliday, the surviving documentation of the investigation and trial is substantial and detailed. It is precisely this quality, a case well documented at the level of legal process, yet unresolved at the level of ultimate responsibility, that has made the case of interest to historians such as Bonderson seeking to recover Victorian crimes that fell outside the small number that achieved lasting national notoriety, while leaving it correspondingly obscure among audiences whose familiarity with the period's crime is shaped principally by its most famous cases. The formal record of the case encompassing the investigation conducted by the Surrey Constabulary, the coroner's inquest that preceded Franz's committal, and the trial proceedings at the Central Criminal Court, together constitute the principal, surviving account of Martha Halliday's death and of the legal process that followed it. No further legal proceedings are recorded as having taken place in connection with the case after Franz's acquittal. No subsequent arrest of Crone or Gerstenberg is documented, and no later reopening of the investigation is recorded in the sources available for this account. The case having proceeded through investigation, committal, and trial to an acquittal was not revisited by the criminal justice system of the period, and it has remained, in the century and more since, a case in which the formal record ends with that acquittal, without a subsequent chapter of renewed investigation or belated resolution. The presence of two named individuals, Crone and Gerstenberg, connected to the case through the evidence presented at Franz's trial, yet never themselves prosecuted, raises a further point worth setting out plainly for the record. Under the criminal procedure of the period, as in the present day, the naming of an individual within the testimony or argument of a trial did not itself constitute a criminal charge, nor did it carry the legal consequences attaching to an indictment. Crone and Gerstenberg were named because the defence's account of the paper's provenance required their theft from Franz to be established. And once that theft was accepted as fact by the jury, in the sense that it was sufficient to raise reasonable doubt as to Franz's own presence at the rectory, the two men's connection to the case rested on that single evidentiary point, rather than on any independent body of evidence placing either of them at Kingswood on the night of the murder. It cannot be stated on the strength of the surviving record that Crone and Gerstenberg entered the rectory, overpowered Martha Halliday, or caused her death, only that the papers found beside her body had, according to evidence accepted at trial, passed through their hands before that night. The distinction is a narrow one, but it is the distinction upon which the case's status as formally unsolved rests, and it is maintained here rather than resolved in either direction beyond what the record supports. The term acquitted, central to the outcome of this case, describes a specific legal status within English criminal procedure, denoting that a defendant, having been tried before a jury on an indictment, has been found not guilty of the offence charged and is thereby discharged from the proceedings without penalty. It stands in direct contrast to a conviction, in which a jury finds a defendant guilty and the court proceeds to pass sentence, and it should not be confused with a finding of innocence in any broader sense, representing instead a legal determination that the evidence presented by the prosecution did not establish guilt to the standard required by law. In the case of Johann Karl Franz, the acquittal returned by the jury at the Central Criminal Court meant that the evidence connecting him to the papers found at Kingswood Rectory, once tested against the defence's account of their theft, was not sufficient to sustain the charge of murder against him, and he was accordingly released without further legal consequence arising from the death of Martha Halliday. Surrey in the middle decades of the 19th century maintained its own constabulary, established under the county police legislation of the preceding decades, a force organised on a county-wide basis and responsible for the investigation of serious crime across its rural parishes, including Kingswood. This organisational structure represented a relatively recent development within the memory of many residents of the county. In 1861, county forces of this kind having generally been established from the late 1830s onward, superseding the older and more informal systems of parish constables and watchmen that had previously provided what limited policing existed in rural districts. The investigation into Martha Halliday's death was thus conducted by officers operating within a still comparatively young institutional framework, one equipped to gather evidence, take statements, and pursue named suspects across parish boundaries in a manner that the older parish-based system would have struggled to achieve, yet one that remained in 1861 reliant principally upon the interpretation of physical evidence and testimony rather than upon the more developed investigative and forensic techniques that later decades would bring to bear upon cases of this kind. The wider pattern of itinerant labour that brought men such as Franz, Crone and Gerstenberg into the vicinity of Kingswood in the summer of 1861 reflected the seasonal demands of the southern English agricultural economy, which drew labourers from a range of origins, domestic and foreign, into its fields and grounds during the months when demand for labour was highest. German labourers formed one identifiable group among this wider itinerant population, moving through the southern counties in search of work on farms, estates and grounds, such as those maintained around a rectory, and their presence in a given district at a given time was neither unusual nor, in itself, cause for particular remark prior to the events of that June. It was only in the aftermath of Martha Halliday's death and the discovery of German-language papers at the scene that this ordinarily unremarkable presence became the focus of sustained investigative and public attention, the papers transforming what might otherwise have remained an unremarked feature of the district's seasonal economy into the central evidentiary thread of a capital case. The account of Kingswood Rectory, preserved through Jan Bonderson's survey of overlooked Victorian murders, situates the case within a wider category of 19th century crimes that possessed the full evidentiary and procedural apparatus of a major trial, a coroner's inquest, a committal, a prosecution and defence contesting substantial physical evidence before a jury at the Central Criminal Court, yet failed to achieve the lasting public recognition accorded to a small number of cases from the same decades. Bonderson's treatment draws upon the trial record and contemporary press coverage to reconstruct the case in some detail, presenting it as an example of the investigative methods and evidentiary reasoning characteristic of the period, and noting the particular twist by which the evidence gathered against Franz was shown, through the defence's argument regarding the theft of the papers, to point toward a different and ultimately unprosecuted pair of suspects. This modern scholarly treatment, together with the local history feature maintained by Surrey's regional press under the getsurrey.co.uk banner, constitutes the principal means by which the case has been preserved for readers beyond the original court and newspaper record of 1861, neither treatment departing from the substance of that original record in its account of the crime, the investigation, or the trial's outcome. The regional treatment of the case within Surrey local history has tended to emphasise the specific texture of Kingswood as a setting, the rectory itself, the rural parish surrounding it, and the particular circumstance of a caretaking couple left in sole charge of a substantial clergyman's residence, as much as the details of the crime and trial themselves. This emphasis reflects the broader purpose of local history writing, which seeks to root a given event firmly within the particular place and community in which it occurred, and it has meant that the case of Martha Halliday has been preserved, where it has been preserved at all, principally as an episode within the history of Kingswood and its parish, rather than as a case of broader national significance within the history of English criminal justice. The trial itself, conducted at the Central Criminal Court in London, rather than at a more local venue such as Reedgate, provided the case with a formal record extending beyond the immediate locality. Yet the substance of the case, its setting, its central figures, and its abiding interest has remained tied most closely to the Surrey parish in which it occurred. The Reverend Taylor's absence from Kingswood at the time of the murder, a circumstance central to the vulnerability that the burglary exploited, was itself unremarkable within the ordinary patterns of clerical life in the period, and nothing in the surviving record suggests that his absence in June of 1861 departed in any way from the customary practices governing a rector's movements away from his parish. Clergy of the established church were not, as a rule, confined to constant residence within their parishes, and periods of absence for reasons of health, family business, or ecclesiastical duty elsewhere were provided for within the ordinary functioning of the parochial system, precisely through arrangements such as the one under which the Hallidays served as caretakers of the rectory in his stead. The tragedy that unfolded at Kingswood in June of 1861 did not arise from any irregularity in this arrangement, but from the exploitation of an arrangement that was, in every other recorded instance across the county and the period, entirely ordinary and without incident. The case of Martha Halliday was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete.